Hey guys, it's Makeshift, and today I'm going to show you how to sew a triangular seam just like this. So you often run into this situation when you're doing color blocking for a plush, and color blocking is when you make a color transition by creating a seam rather than doing something like applique or top stitching. Most of the time when I have a plush that has many triangular shapes in it like this, including stripes or just any kind of zigzag pattern, I typically do applique because it is easier to do applique, particularly with my embroidery machine rather than doing this color blocking technique. But this character only has stripes going on in this area, so there's not a whole lot of triangular seams going on, so I chose to do color blocking for this character rather than making the whole thing out of applique. And if you need a video on how to do color blocking, you can check out another one that I've made previously that I will link. So in this situation, we have a stripe that comes to a point right here. And so rather than having this be top stitch on, this is actually a seam that I have sewn into the plush itself. And so these seams can be a bit tricky because you're sewing very different shapes. One is concave and one is convex, as well as having this little point here, which can be difficult to sew. So I'll walk you through how I do it. So we need to sew these two shapes together, and the first thing I like to do is to actually draw on my seam. I always add seam allowance to my pattern pieces. This is just a habit I have from sewing clothes, and not all people do that. Some people just make their patterns by having it end where their seam ends, and then they just draw on a seam allowance around that. But I always add a 1/4 inch seam allowance to all of my patterns. So here, this includes seam allowance on the edges, as well as has some notches here to help me line up with this other piece here. And then I've gone ahead and draw on where I want my actual seam to be on both pieces. So both on the stripe itself and then onto the body piece that I'm going to sew it onto. And I don't always do this for my patterns. Typically it's a pretty simple shape like a straight line or maybe a slight curve like this, and I don't feel like I need to draw on a guide. But in the case of sewing triangular seams, I do find it very helpful to go ahead and draw on the seam itself because it'll really help you line up this pointed edge. So I've got my seam traced on both shapes as well as some notches. And you can just mark these notches when you go ahead and pattern the color blocking on your plush, which again, you can check out one of my videos if you need some help to do color blocking. So now I'm going to go ahead and pin these together. So with right sides together, you want to pin your stripe to your body piece or whatever piece you're pinning it to. So the first thing I like to do is actually stick a pin through the point of one of my pieces. So I have my stripe here, and I'm going to take a pin and stick it right at the tip of the seam line where I want the stripe to end. And then I'm going to stick the pin in the other point. So right here where this triangle is ending here, I'm going to stick the pin through that point as well. And that really is just going to help you line up exactly where your points are going to meet. And then you can go ahead and twist it to where one of your sides lines up with the other. So I typically start with the longer side, so I'm just going to go ahead and pin this long side together using the notches that I made when I patterned it to help me line up the rest of the piece. Okay, and now you can't leave this pin in here because it sticks through and this will not go through your sewing machine well, so I just go ahead and pin it in place and then take it out, and then it'll still stay in the same place that you had it. So now what you do is sew along your first line. So I'm going to go ahead and sew along this seam line right here. So I'm going to go ahead and sew right along this line here. I'm going to stop at the point of the triangle and just backstitch at the front and the end, and then move on to the next part after that. And I have a walking foot on. If you've never used one before, it has an extra set of feed dogs on the top that helps move the fabric along the way. If you work a lot with minky, I'd recommend getting one of these. They're really nice and it makes sewing minky a lot easier. I also have a really bad habit of sewing over my pins. I do not recommend doing this. Say pull them out as you go, but I guess I like to live on the dangerous side. Right, I'm just gonna back stitch. So I've sewn exactly along this line here, stopping at the point of the triangle. So now what I'm going to do is to take a pair of scissors and trim into the point right close to the drawing that I've done here. So you don't actually want to clip into the drawing, but you want to get close to it. And this is just going to help you turn the fabric to make that point. If you didn't do this, it would be very difficult to manipulate the fabric and bend it to where you can actually sew this other seam. So I've gotten pretty close, but I haven't quite hit it, and that's exactly what I want. So now I can go ahead and flip this piece to sew along this other seam. So I like to start by going to the edge of the seam and pinning at the very end, and then making my way inward towards the point. And this can get pretty difficult and finicky, but you want to try and get this fabric to lay as smooth as you can, right to where you've trimmed the fabric. And it can bunch up, but you want to get it smooth. And then you just want to sew right along the line that you've drawn. So I'm just going to sew along this last line here, and I'm going to meet the point of where I sewed to earlier on my first seam. So I sewed this bottom seam here right along the lines, and checking the front, it lies nice and flat. There's no puckering going on. And so the last thing you want to do is actually press this seam. So it might seem a little counterintuitive because minky doesn't really like heat. You can actually melt it if you apply too much heat. But if you apply just a little bit of heat on your iron using the polyester setting to iron this seam, it's going to help it lay more flat than it would if you just left it alone. So I like to press all my seams when I do color blocking because it just helps them look a little bit more clean and a little bit more flat. So I'm going to go ahead and do this and just press lightly along this seam that I just sewed with the polyester setting. And so that's it. I've gone ahead and pressed it, so now this seam lies open on the back side and looks nice and clean and ready to go and use this pattern piece in the rest of my plush. So I hope you guys learned something today, and thank you for watching. Bye-bye.